I met Chris Wiggins maybe 5 years ago, very shortly after I left academia to start Virtue. And he asked me this question that I had never heard put quite this way. He said, "How do you operationalize ethics?" I never heard the word operationalize before. So at first I was confused, but then I understood what he was saying. And that resulted in many conversations over the course of years. He's now written a book with Matthew Jones called How Data Happened. It's sort of the history of data, and I sort of start off the conversation to see with just wondering, what do you mean when you talk about the history of data? What does that even mean to ask? The conversation is really wide ranging. There's nothing for me in particular to sort of highlight or clarify. We talk a lot about the move from concerns around government surveillance of its citizens to corporate surveillance. Of course, lots of people are talking now about things like quote unquote surveillance capitalism. And we talk a lot about the extent to which technologists have power to change the political system as they see fit and how they should think about what they're doing in terms of having that kind of power. As Chris puts it, he wants to give young technologists a vocabulary for thinking about their impact on the world through their innovations. So that's what the conversation's about. Housekeeping, as usual, if you have anything to ask me, either there's an issue you want me to address on the show or someone that you want me to talk to, email me at that is an ethical machines, at reedblackman.com. Write a review of the podcast, give it 5 stars, share with your friends, etc., etc. All right, let's go talk to Chris. So, Chris, you've written a book on two things that I wouldn't think go together nicely, or I wouldn't think that they would be a pair: data and history, or the history of data. I suppose I want to ask, what's that all about? Why should we care about? Before I get to the story about why you wrote the book, but what's the big thing between history and data, and why do we need to understand the history of data?
I think it's a really understudied topic, the history of data, but I mean, more generally, the history of technology. I was raised as a technologist, and that sort of technical education is not generally one that centers history. We sort of go straight into
Sure.
writing code or doing math or what have you. But I
You build
think,
stuff.
yeah, and I think particularly as the impact of technology expands, it sort of goes outside the lines. It's useful to understand how it got that way. And history is one of the ultimate root cause analyses. The other thing, of course, about history is that it makes you realize, oh, it didn't have to be this way. That all sorts of things that we assume just had to be the way they are actually really just total historical contingencies. It could have been some other way. And then that gives
Right.
people some creativity to think creatively about how things could be.
Good. So give me an example of what's the case now that we take to be a kind of, fixed, divine stipulated condition of existence regarding data or technology that actually, if you understand the history, you understand just how contingent it is.
Well, some of these, there's some micro and macro examples. I think a fun micro example is this example about how airline tickets are all, or for a long time, were ruled by one particular IT system called Sabre, SABRE. And so, when I was young, my tickets used to say Sabre on it, and it was part of the same sort of IT database system. Never really thought about it. And that whole system grew out of a military system called SAGE, which grew
Hmm.
out of Cold War concerns for tracking every airplane possible.
Yeah, interesting.
And the way SAGE became Sabre was from two guys who happened to sit next to each other on a cross-country flight. One of them happened to be the CEO of an airline company, and the other happened to be somebody who was working on building SAGE and sort of closed the deal by the time they landed on the other coast.
Amazing.
Exactly. So some historical examples are like that, where there's sort of a micro story that makes you think about how much of the world is just accident. I'd say macro topics are things like the way we think about privacy and how in the 70s, for example, there was a big concern about too much data being in the hands of those in power. And the way we talked about constraining power was in the form of regulation, mostly from the right and the left in terms of political parties. And at the time in the 70s, everybody was concerned about too much data in the hands of those in power. And so the right and the left got together and constrained too much power in the hands of a few. The difference being that
Hmm.
that was state power. So there was a lot of fear that the US government would have too much power for having too much data. And a lot of our privacy regulations that we rely on today are based from that time. And yet now we have a real free market idealism around how private companies are just going to work that all out. in our
I
favor, and
what
there's sort
what
of
was
no sense that we should have similar constrained or consumer protection.
and what was the kind of data that people were concerned about in the '70s were going to be ill-gotten and ill-used by states?
Yeah, so it was not transactional data like everything you click on or point, but it was personal
Right.
data like your purchasing history and your tax records, as well as, private and sensitive information. People had very pointed illustrative examples about very personal information you wouldn't want to get out, as well as things about your kids' schooling. There was a lot of concerns that, your incompetent teachers from the government run school would get things wrong and you wouldn't be able to see it and get it right. And a lot of the acts, with the regulations, which we now think of as constraining and protecting student information, actually grew out of that concern that the government would somehow get
Mhm.
it wrong, and parents needed to be able to get in there and correct the record if their student grades were wrong or something like that.
So do you think is the idea something like, okay, look, is your view something like we understood the threat in the '70s that a certain kind of actor would get a bunch of data, acquire a bunch of data about us, perhaps use it intentionally or unintentionally in ways that are harmful to the general citizenry, and we then passed appropriate or close to appropriate laws, regulations, etc. And now we're faced with the same kind of structural issue, but the entity in question is not the state, but rather private corporations. And yet we've seen very little in the way of regulation or laws to protect citizens. Is that the issue?
Sure. I think that's well summarized. I'll make an extension, which is even closer to your core, which is ethics. So, another thing that happened in the '70s was the development of a government specification for ethics, in that people felt like their tax dollars were being used for things that were of questionable ethics. There was a couple of flashpoints. One was the Tuskegee experiment, and the other was federal taxpayer research that people were scared was going to be used for research on aborted fetuses at the time after Roe v. Wade. So
Mm,
Roe v. Wade, January 22nd, 1973, if I remember correctly. And so in the '70s, there was a lot of concern about how do we think about the ethics of federally funded research in the wake of
mm.
these scandals. So we, as a really Congress people and a commission, developed a government specification of ethics. And that's another, example where there were great harms and a lot of concern and a reaction. And now sort of great harms don't have the sort of a centralized reaction from any central player.
So that's sort of interesting though, because there is a place where there's a disanalogy, it seems, because as you've articulated, if I have this right, it was the case that citizens are giving money to government by way of taxes, and they want to make sure that that tax money is being spent appropriately, ethically, etc. That's going to include acting ethically with regards to what you know about your people. So, with regards to what data you've got. And so there's that sort of, l- you know, there's an initial motive. Not only don't be frivolous with my money, but don't be unethical with my money.
Mhm.
And then you fast forward to corporations. We don't really have that same thing where we think that the corporations, standardly people don't think this anyway, the corporations, like we've given something to the corporations and now they owe us in some way. Instead, the argument has been, I mean, the government one sounds indirect, like you owe us, you have to be responsible with our data by virtue of the fact that you have to be responsible with our money. And with corporations, we don't get to do that. We just get to say, you have to be responsible with my data. But that's going to require a kind of concern around one's data as opposed to concern about one's money, where concern about one's money, everyone's already got this concern that their tax money is being used poorly. But I think most people don't have that instinct that their data is being used poorly, if they even have a conception of what their data amounts to.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fun disanalogies there, including I think a lot of people don't really care so much what companies are doing with their data.
Yeah.
Whereas there was a lot of fear of big government in the early '70s in particular, where people wanted to make sure that massive, a massive dossier wasn't being uh, created about every individual, every American individual that would track them in ways that were nefarious and be used to coerce them. People don't seem to
Yeah.
have that same fear about big corporations.
Yeah. I mean, I had this conversation with Carissa Valise, I don't know, a bunch of episodes ago, and she's a big privacy advocate. And I have to confess, I find it difficult for me to get worked up about it. Maybe you can convince me that I should. Carissa was trying to convince me that I should, but part of me thinks, well, these corporations, they collect a bunch of data, but all that data goes into these, servers. No one's looking at this data. Maybe it's used, but I don't have any, there's not some person on the other end. We use sort of sloppy language, I think, like the corporations know all about us, as though the corporation were a single agent that possesses beliefs about individuals or that they have knowledge. But really, what that's shorthand for is when we say the corporations know everything about us, that's shorthand for corporations have a bunch of data about, millions of citizens stored in servers that sometimes they'll run through algorithms to make certain kinds of automated predictions about them and serve them ads. And I find it hard to get worked up about that because the language of the corporation knows all this about you makes it sound very surveillance-y, very Eastern Germany.
Yep.
But I don't. That's not what's actually going on. I don't know. Do you think that I should be more worked up, or are you worked up about it?
I mean, I'll agree with both halves of your excluded middle. So I will agree with you that the language is sloppy, and particularly any sort of anthropomorphic language about the way companies behave is sloppy language. I'll agree with that. On the other hand, I do think that there's room for concern about the way that our data is being used. So the big one that gets discussed a lot is surveillance around advertising. And
Yeah,
Shoshana Zuboff has a whole book about this, right? Surveillance capitalism.
too
And the,
big. That book is too big.
and the idea that, right, a lot of it is right there in the name. Like if you think about the title of the book,
Right.
yeah,
I
golly.
read it. I think I read her New Yorker article or New York Times article, something like that. And I thought, okay, I get it. Then I went to get the book and I thought, no, no, no. This thing is gargantuan. I get it. Okay.
So a lot of it is that idea that
Yeah.
surveillance capitalism, particularly instantiated in machine learning algorithms that are informed by abundant transactional data, not just personal data, but every transaction, could be used to persuade us, right? So, in the context of advertising, which is a type of persuasion, I think there's a fear that, like, not only are the persuaders hidden, to use a phrase from the 70s, hidden persuaders, but
Yeah.
also they're going to be really, really good at it and effectively will be able to coerce us to persuade us in a way that is too potent. I think there's some
Right.
other concerns about privacy that are a little closer to realization. The
Do you think that one's not close to realization? That it's a, I mean, because
It's just
when I
it's
hear
just
that stuff, I
difficult.
think it's,
Scientifically, it's difficult to substantiate. There's abundant social science literature debating whether or not advertising matters for the kind of social harm that people are concerned about. So people
I mean,
go ahead.
I can buy that it creates certain kinds of social harms, but I don't think it does it in quite the way that it's articulated. So usually it's something like they're manipulating the users, the
Right.
individual users that they're getting. Remember that documentary, The Social Dilemma? It's sort of like
Sure.
they're pushing the buttons in your brain. And I think
Exactly.
that's completely
Exactly.
overwrought. Like you showed me some ads for a towel, and then I bought the towel. So that's actually a really useful towel. The sand doesn't stick to it. Like I don't feel, even upon reflection, that I was manipulated in some underhanded way. I think they exaggerate the powers they have over individuals. The exception that I want to make, though, or that I think the relevant point that they should be making is something like I can buy to some extent that they can manipulate populations without any claim
Mhm.
about manipulating this or that individual. So I imagine they can predict something like if we show this ad to this many people based on what we've seen so far, we've released it on this subpopulation of, let's just call it 1,000 people. We got this kind of response. We can reliably predict, let's suppose that if we release it to 10 million, we're going to get this kind of response. And so I think they could make probably legitimate predictions or potentially legitimate predictions about how populations will move. But I don't think they can make any kinds of predictions about how Reed Blackman or Chris Wiggins are going to move in response to that ad.
Yeah. So within the context of digital marketing, there's plenty of A/B tests. They're just not published. So digital marketing all the time is optimizing people's reactions to
Right.
things. But the thing that people are concerned about in terms of harms, and that documentary is one good example, those things are more difficult for social scientists to actually empirically test, right? It's very
Verify,
difficult to
yeah.
do attribution to say that, societal harms are due to machine learning empowered algorithms. So
Right.
that's a concern for many people around privacy, is that by knowing a lot about us, you'll be really good at persuading us, which in the context of digital marketing is pretty well borne out. Like these companies are still in business, and digital marketers and performance marketers, meaning people who actually care if their money is being wasted,
Yeah.
generally
Sure.
find that these things work for convincing you to buy a towel that the sand doesn't stick to. Thanks for that example, Reed. There
Well,
are other
one thing to say though is that
please.
persuasion can be okay, right? Rational persuasion is perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, yeah,
There's reasonable incentives, right? Like they show me something that I want, and it's not unreasonable for me to want a thing, and then I
yeah.
get it. It's not obvious to me. I mean, did they do something to influence my behavior? Sure, but there are influences that undermine autonomy or freedom. And then there are those that are just part of the story about why, how I exercise my freedom. Oh, I see a towel that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. I think I'd like that. And then I buy it. So, there's a lot that goes into the word persuasion that makes it sound underhanded, but it's just influence. And then there's rational and non rational influence. And there's morally problematic and non morally problematic influence. You know, I tell my kids if they do this, then I'll get them a treat or whatever. I don't think it's underhanded or undermining their autonomy in some way. I've given them a reasonable incentive. And then I sort of think now I'm going on a bit of a rant here, but people are like, oh, do you want them to use your data to sell you stuff? And I think, well, they already use my desires, my passions, my loves. Like I love rock climbing. And so they showed me an ad for climbing shoes and I bought climbing shoes. But so they're already using things way more important, way more central to my identity, like what I care about, what I love, what I desire, how I want my life to unfold. They already use those things to sell me things. So using my data, okay, that seems pretty sufficiently far from my identity that I can't get myself worked up about it.
So, yes, there's a statistical type of manipulation that privacy touches on, which invokes our fears and which I think is difficult to assess the impact of. And I think you're right. It's also difficult to assess the reality of. There's smaller things like just leaking our data. So some people are concerned about privacy because these companies are sloppy and there's just leaks, and we
Sure.
just don't like the idea that they're just keeping around of our data because we're going to find our
Yeah.
password in a database of breaches.
Fair enough.
And then there's the other thing, which is a little more pointed, which is not sort of statistical manipulation, but the idea that somebody is actually going to, find a nefarious thing about us in the data and then use it to
Yeah.
dox us or harass us
Yeah.
or something like that. And I,
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that draws people to end-to-end encryption is the idea
Sure.
that, I can communicate a message that even if a nefarious bad actor gets hold of the encrypted message, they won't be able to harass
Yeah.
me or use that thing in a targeted way against me. So I think those are a couple of things that make people concerned about privacy.
Yeah. Those strike me as legitimate concerns, but I think people tend to misdescribe the nature of their concern or something along those lines. So when I think of something like a privacy violation or an undermining of my autonomy, I think of something as it's, if you like, intrinsically wrong. I've been wronged by virtue of their, say, knowing that about me. By virtue of their having that data, I've been wronged. Independently of what they do with it, that would be a further wrong. The example that I like to use is this example where, and then I said this to Carissa as well, something like, suppose I'm at work and I notice that every time the fire alarm goes off, this guy in my office, Achilles, he grabs his heel as though to
Mhm,
protect it.
mhm,
And then I start, this happens enough times where I start to think, I kind of think this guy's heel is vulnerable. And
mhm,
then you fast forward, we get into a fight, and I deal him the mortal blow, right? I go for his heel, and he's out. So I, went for Achilles' heel. Here's two kinds of things you might think are wrong. Read, you inferred some data about him that you shouldn't have inferred, or something
mhm.
like that. You know something about him that he wanted to keep private, namely the vulnerability of his heel, and you killed him, where you dealt him the moral blow. So it'd be weird if someone said to me, Reed, you did two things wrong. You killed him and you invaded his privacy. And I'd be like, either I didn't invade his privacy or my invasion of his privacy was such a tiny wrong that it barely matters. And it's really the downstream the downstream harm or the downstream wrong from the possession of the knowledge about the vulnerability of his heel.
Yeah.
And so then I kind of think the same thing about data leaks. If my data gets leaked, that's not, and someone has it that is not supposed to have access to it, and then uses it to say, whatever, dox me, cancel me, blackmail me, whatever it is. The thing that's the wrong, if there is the wrong, is them blackmailing me or whatever it is. But the privacy, I wouldn't say something like, I've been intrinsically wronged by virtue of the fact that the data was leaked and now somebody has it. I've been instrumentally wronged or something along those lines, but I find it hard to say something like, oh, my autonomy has been undermined as a result, or I don't know.
Well,
Yeah,
you
I
have.
just don't.
So I think you're going to an interesting place, which is to connect privacy violation with autonomy, which again is, as you know, one of the three principles of the Belmont conception
Sure.
of ethics, right? That ethics can be
Yeah.
framed in terms of ethical principles, autonomy being one of them. Did you, in your previous discussions about privacy, discuss Helen Missenbaum's conception of contextual integrity and that privacy is about flows of information rather than a fact? So one way to think about privacy is that
I don't
privacy
know.
is an attribute of a fact, and the other way of thinking about privacy is an attribute of a disclosure. So the transmission of information is the thing to which you would ascribe the test of whether or not privacy has been violated. So it's okay for your
Yeah.
fact to be private, but give it to your doctor, that's fine. But if you give it
Sure.
to your
Sure.
boss, that's not fine. right? So the fact,
Yeah.
so the privacy is not an attribute of the fact. The privacy is an attribute of the flow of information.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fine way of carving it up. I'm okay with that. I like to carve it up between I'll call it active and passive conception of privacy. That's what I usually call it. So there's passive conception of privacy is my privacy is respected on the condition that someone else has done certain kinds of things to ensure that things are not known about me, like anonymization or pseudonymization or aggregating data, blah blah blah,
Okay.
differential privacy.
Yep.
And then I think of active conception of privacy as something that you exercise. It's a right you exercise. So just like when I close the blinds in my bedroom, I'm
Yep.
exercising my right to privacy. It's not something done to me. I'm not passive. I'm active. So too, when I give someone my data, or I consent for them to give my data to somebody else, that's me exercising an what I would call an active conception of privacy. I'm exercising my right to privacy, something along those lines.
That's nice. Yeah. So Nussbaum has this conception of privacy as being all about contextual integrity and about describing the flows of information. And she's got a couple of tests for the context. I actually think it's useful to think about privacy in terms of the disclosure. And does that
Hmm.
disclosure challenge our conceptions of ethics? Like, does it challenge the autonomy and respect for the persons involved? Does it create harms? Does it somehow amplify injustice? And that is, I don't know. I think that's a nice way of thinking about whether privacy is being
Yeah,
violated is to analyze it where the unit of analysis is not the fact, but the disclosure or the flow of information.
yeah, yeah. You think a lot about. I know that you've said a lot in your book about the connection between data and power,
Yes.
and I'd like you to say a little bit about that. It's always struck me as odd to talk about power in a way. So people will say things like, and I'm not saying this is you, but so tell me how you're different than this, or maybe you're the same. People will talk about things like, oh, we've got to undo the power structures that be. We've got to change the power. It's all about power. And I think, well, no, it's about authority. People who have power that ought to be in power, that's a good thing. People who ought not to be in power, who are in power, that's a bad thing. So it's not the case that you just want to undo the power structures, because it could be the case that the power structures are as they ought to be, or at least in some respects they are as they ought to be. So when the it's not merely the case that the president has the power to say issue an executive order, it's that he or she has the authority to do so.
Yes.
Of course they've
So
got the power, but it's the authority that we care about. So when people say things like, "Oh, data is about power," I think, okay, but there's an independent sort of a you can tell me all the things you want about power, but I want to know if the power is not distributed as it ought to be. For all I know, you could say it's going to change the distribution of power, and maybe that's a bad thing. I don't know. I need to hear more about how it's currently distributed and why it ought to be distributed differently.
yeah, so you use the word ought to and you use the word should a few times
Hmm.
in your analysis of power there.
They're an
So
ethicist's favorite words.
okay, I'll take your word for it. And
Yeah, yeah,
lordy,
yeah.
lordy, that makes me glad I'm not an ethicist. It sounds like a really hard job. I mean, I do think it's important to think about power, and I came to this realization late in life. So there's a couple of reasons. One is I think that technology is having an impact, and technologists I think are having a very difficult time wrestling with that because it's outside of our upbringing, right? So the other is that people often do have feelings like somebody ought to do everything, and they don't have a lot of real sense for what are the powers that actually are relevant for constraining power. So, like as young people in the United States, you grow up and somebody tells you about checks and balances, and you have this idea of this sort of three-player game in the US government between the three branches of government. You grow up with that. You're like, okay, everything's going to be cool because we're never going to have a king because of the other two branches. It's all going to be fine. So, similarly, we try to give an analysis by the end of the book about making a three-player game between state power, corporate power, and what we call people power, but you could call it private power or maybe market power if you want to focus
Now
on
we're
that.
back in the 60s.
That's right. That's right. It's
Yeah.
people power is as a phrase is
Flower power.
that's
Yeah, yeah.
right. That's exactly
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I will confess to being a child of the 70s. So yeah, it's a phrase you don't hear very much anymore, but we found it a useful rubric in
Mm,
the 13th chapter for thinking about centers of power. But let me get back to the role of power for technologists. Right after the Snowden revelations in 2013, Philip Rokeaway, the cryptographer, wrote this essay directed at his fellow cryptographers that's called The Moral Character of Cryptographic Work. And it opens cryptography rearranges power, it changes who can do what from what. And it was,
mhm.
it's an essay written by somebody who, like me, was raised a technologist, And probably he grew up his life focusing on the sweet mathematics of cryptography, which is pretty cool. And
Yeah,
then after Snowden revelations, I think he was like, wow, that we are actually, we, my community, are really at the tip of the spear, whereas we thought we
mm,
were in the basement or enjoying our sort of harmless
yeah,
game. This is a realization that's happened to mathematicians for centuries, by the way, that they think they're working on sort of an abstraction and then they realize it actually has some impact.
and then
Physicists,
there's the Manhattan Project.
that's exactly right. But my PhD was in
Right.
physics. And so I wasn't sort of raised with that worldview, and by the time I got my PhD, I was surrounded by a community that knew that their work had impact on the world and also
Yeah,
knew that, they were coming from a field whose traditions, whose definitions of an important problem, whose funding was all intimately tied with things that had real world impact, including martial impact, meaning impact related
sure.
to war.
Yeah,
So, on the other hand, for computer scientists or machine learners or statisticians, I don't know that everybody's raised with that idea that their work has a moral character, to use Philip
yeah,
Rokeaway's phrase. So we thought it was important, or I thought it was important, for young technologists to realize that the things that they're doing, particularly deployed computationally and at scale, have politics. Politics, not in the sense of voting, but in the sense of
sure, sure.
rearranging power, right? Which again, like as a technologist, I was never raised using the word politics, but I've learned to become comfortable with the idea that, technology has politics in the sense that it rearranges power. So, but you said that you don't like hearing people talk about power because they're going to say what should be done. So we try to stay
Yeah,
away from what should be done in part because there's no one right answer to how radical a reform should be. There's always going to be people who think that the reform that should be done is a rearrangement and other people who think that the reform is an overturning of tables. And so there's no one
sure.
right
Yeah, yeah.
answer.
There's
There's no
defund the
right.
police, and there's modify the police. Everything in
That's
between.
right. And
Sure.
I find that makes reform very difficult because it's very difficult to get people to align even on how radical the reform is appropriate. So,
Sure.
we read our book and I've had technologists say to me, "Oh, your book is very accusatory." And then I've had other people read the book and say, you don't spend enough time talking about how we need to dismantle the underlying structures that
Mm,
empower technology. So there's no one right answer to how radical reform should be, which can make one of the many reasons reform is difficult. In addition to the fact that
yeah.
generally power is going to power, meaning generally people who are in power are interested in using new technologies to defend their powers rather than to empower the defenseless.
Yeah, so let me sort of, I don't know if push back is the right phrase, but let me push back a little bit about on a couple of things. Or yeah, so one is, well, what do you want technologists to do? Let's grant, for the sake of argument, that what they're doing is they're playing a role in moving around power in this way or that, but they are, a junior data scientist at a Fortune 500 company, or maybe they're one of a team of people at, say, an OpenAI, or maybe they're, mid-career, even senior level, but we're talking about power moving among massive players, and you're just talking about technologists who have different, just like any other person, they've got different viewpoints, different beliefs, different values. And so I guess it's sort of like, can't someone just say, yeah, I guess I'm moving around power, but I don't know where I'm moving it to. I couldn't know how I'm moving it, where I'm moving it to. There are too many causal variables involved. I mean, I'm one link in a massive causal chain. Like, I collected the data, I tested the model, or I validated the model, or I was in charge of deployment or of monitoring, but there's so much more going on around. The fact that I'm a technologist playing some role in moving around power doesn't show that I should do anything about it, since I'm just one small link in a causal chain. That's one pushback. The other pushback goes from the other direction, which is something like, aren't you really, you're saying that technologists are moving around power, but is that really true? I mean, isn't that sort of a technologist's fantasy to think, "Oh, look how powerful I am. I build these models, I build these algorithm or train these machines, and I'm really powerful." When in fact, you know, I know that you think the technology is political, but you know what's political? Politics. And that's how, politics and money. And that's how real power is transferred. And so it might be a nice fantasy to think that the technologies are so powerful. In fact, not only are they a minor link in a causal chain, each individual data scientist or engineer or whatever you want to call them, but really their causal chain is weak compared to the other ways in which power gets moved around. And so why focus on the power that gets moved around by technologists?
Golly. Well, there's 2 pushbacks there. One is, again, you use the word should, which I try to stay away from. Like, I don't wanna tell young technologists what they should do, but I do want
Mm,
them to understand power so they can at least make informed decisions, and understand the context.
okay, fair enough.
Similarly, I want reformers not to throw away their shot, so to speak. I would like reformers to understand the system well enough to attempt reform in a way that's has a high probability of success. But at your second point being more recent in my brain, I have to uh, make sure that I address that as well. It is an interesting framing, the way people think about identity and power and whatnot. I had said many technologists like to believe that they're doing something that's harmless, and then they realize that what they're doing has some sort of moral character, to use Philip Rokeaway's
Sure.
term. You had said no. Actually, technologists love to think that their work has moral character, but in fact, what they're doing is harmless. I would say somewhere in between
It's
is
for what it's worth, it's the opposite for philosophers. Our work has tons of moral character and absolutely no impact. Academic philosophers, that is.
again.
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Once again, I will say I'm glad I don't have your job. Sounds complicated. The way I think about things in terms of the impact of technology has been influenced by Lessig's book Code 2.0, where he talks about the impact on an individual being about norms, laws, markets, and architecture, meaning you as an individual are subjected to forces which include societal norms, societal laws, markets like economic forces, as well as architecture, which include changes in technology. And writ large, to some extent, you can look at society and say society is being pushed by these four forces as well. There's technology, which is changing things, but technology doesn't change things on its own. It changes things within the context of economic markets, which have their own timescale for adapting to a technology. Like
Sure.
a year ago this month, ChatGPT happened within the span of a month. People were publishing books about prompt engineering and hiring people for prompt engineers. So the markets responded quickly. And our norms took another few months to respond because people were still trying to decide, am I allowed to use ChatGPT to write my friend's obituary? Or, should I use ChatGPT to write a dossier that I give to the judge or something like that? And
Yeah.
our laws obviously take even longer to respond. But all of those things are four forces. So I wouldn't say that technology, or to use Lessig's word, architecture, is somehow supreme among those four forces. The other three are relevant, but I would say that it's certainly part of the forces. Now, what does an individual have like omnipotent power? Absolutely not. But
No,
I
of
mean,
course. Yeah,
like
sure.
an individual, certainly along with other individuals, can have a big impact for good or for ill. Wait, before you
Yeah.
go on to the next thing, the other thing that I think concerns me as an engineering educator is all these students that I educate, which who are more and more, I think, every year concerned with what I'll call fear of moral injury. So they fear that they will go into
Mm,
a company and in the process of advancing their career, they will be asked to do things which later they will look back and say, that was actually like a really bad thing that I did, even though it got me
mm.
promoted. But I feel like that was a really bad thing. And to get back to your invocation of the documentary Social Dilemma, that whole documentary is full of people who did pretty well, and now are retired in their late 20s and have time to think about, like, was that bad? Am I the baddie, so to speak? So yeah, I think I would like for young technologists to feel like they have some sort of vocabulary for making ethical decisions, and also, getting back to chapter 13, a sense for how they as individuals can bring about what legal scholars call private ordering. The idea that private individuals can impact power in the same way that the state, regulate power.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I take it you sort of the more general point is something like, here's me saying, in your voice, something like, listen, I'm officially agnostic about how power is distributed, whether it's distributed well or poorly. Not about how it's distributed, but whether it's distributed well or poorly and where it ought to go differently, where it ought to be channeled differently. What I'd like to do is get technologists to understand just the role that they play, that what they do does have, at least an aggregate, if not at the exact individual level in all cases, has some kind of effect on how society fares. And with that awareness, they can then make their own ethical judgments as to whether things are just fine and dandy or whether things are problematic and need to change and how they ought to change. But me, this is Chris speaking now, I'm not going to tell you which way they should go or not. I sort of just want to turn the light on so you can see that there's a substantive choice to be made here and
Right.
that you're making it whether or not you know it.
Yeah, I think that's all fair. I mean, part of my job as a professor is to be
Mm,
descriptive, and it's different from being a parent, right? Like as a professor, like you can do a lot of benefit for the species by saying like, here's the way things are. And
sure.
as a parent, on the other hand, you are supposed to say like, here's the way things ought to be. Here's what you should do. As a
Right.
professor, like somebody who's writing a book about this, I'm not so much trying to tell people here's what you ought to do, but I do think
Yeah.
that technologists don't grow up with technologists and non-technologists alike, people who care about technology don't grow up with a conception of how technology got this way and data empowered technology in particular and how it sits within a larger context.
So let's go back to the executive branches, so to speak, the balance of powers,
Yeah.
because this seems to feed all into that. So there's the corporations, the states, and there's people power. I take it. So one question is something like, do you have a political goal here, which is for technologists to unite in some fashion or other to be a counterbalance to the other two members of the holy trinity of power?
Well, they already are. It's just not everybody seems to realize it that they have that
Hmm.
as their option. So, like, there's technologists who will organize, or they'll stage walkouts, or they will be whistleblowers.
True. Yep.
And so, like, there's a few technologists who not only realize that that's something that's in their capability, but act on it. Well, technologists don't seem to realize that, like, they're in a special place as individuals at these tech companies, particularly at least as long as it lasts that those people are in demand. They have the potential for a lot of impact. Again, though, I just would like them to see themselves as one of the ways that they order power, in addition to the way that corporations effectively regulate each other, and in addition to the way that we all look to the state or government in one way or the other to fix it. I think we have a knee jerk reaction, at least in the States, to say, okay, well, something's messed up, so US federal government should fix it. And US federal government is just one small slice of all the various powers that are at play.
Sure. There's another thing, which is just that there's some things that we don't want to have laws against, that we don't want to regulate against, even though we think they're, say, ethically bad and things should be otherwise. It's a problem with the culture or something along those lines. So,
Let's
my
hear more
go-to
about that.
well, I mean, my go-to example for just things that are ethically wrong that we don't want laws against are, say, cheating on your spouse. Don't
Mhm,
do it. I think it's ethically wrong. I think you're betraying your spouse, lying
mhm,
to a friend. Don't do that either.
mhm,
But I sure as hell don't want to live in a country where it's literally illegal to do such things. People go to jail for that sort of thing.
mhm.
That seems a terrible place to live. That seems oppressive.
Yeah, that's an
Um,
interesting one
and
because,
so,
of course, we do have breach of contract and litigation. So we have laws, and like there's things that the U.S. government can do, for example, and then there's
sure,
litigation, which is I think underappreciated as a constraint. A lot of things happen from just breach of contract, people like signing an agreement between each other,
sure,
and then it ends up in court, not because the state is enacting, but because the state provides
right,
arena in which private individuals litigate and
yeah.
reestablish society's conceptions of fairness.
I mean, there's other in the tech world. I think of examples like people having emotional relationships with virtual whatever chatbots,
Mhm,
avatars, whatever you want to call them.
mhm,
I'm not sure. First of all, I'm not sure that it's unethical.
mhm.
Weird to me anyway.
Right, so
Strike.
there's a statement about norms, even if we're not gonna make a statement about laws or ethics.
Right, exactly. So I mean, it's not always going to be about let's have a kind of political. Let's all hey, we technologists, let's get together and talk about the politics of this in the sense of distributing power. Some of it is just
Right.
we're going to have an impact on the culture in a certain way. I mean, I'm not sure that smartphones have done wonders for our culture. I'm not sure that social media has done wonders for our culture. I don't think that they should be outlawed. I think certain maybe ways that they operate but should be potentially outlawed, but I'm not sure that it's a net benefit to the culture. It's probably fairly disastrous. I mean, everyone just think of sort of, we both have kids, and we have smartphones. We probably don't want our kids glued to their phones, walking away looking. It's ethically objectionable, not in the sense that they're doing anything, I feel like morally wrong, but in the sense that it's just not conducive to a good life, to a flourishing life. Like look up from the screen and go see the world. But I think that's another way in which technologists may think about power. That's not it's not about laws or pushing for laws or regulations or pushing even against corporate power. It's that there's, I don't know, you might call them sort of, I don't know, soft power. Or you might call it something like, yeah, just the cultural impact of the tool as opposed to its legal or political ramifications.
Yes, I think that speaks to its normative impact and your
Hmm.
impact on the market, and it also comes back to what I was saying earlier about technologists, young technologists having a fear of moral injury. I think there's technologists where, like, I don't wanna be in a situation in which my manager encourages me to do something, and I know it would be good for my career, and then either at the time or later, I'll look back and then say, like, somehow that was just bad, and they don't have even a
Right.
vocabulary for thinking about what they mean when they say that was bad.
Is there anything that we didn't get to that you wanted to get to?
Um Well, I just wanted to thank you, Reed. Years ago, as I started to think about technology ethics, I was so excited to meet you as a real philosophy professor in ethics, so I could
Nice.
ask you, help me understand what I need to know about high philosophy and ethics. And you valuably told me nothing. That, like there's like a whole tradition in high philosophy that like is not going to help you understand applied ethics. So that was very
Yeah.
useful to me.
Good. I'm glad I could save you a lot of reading.
You did.
I mean, I'm happy to talk about that stuff. It's just not gonna. Yeah, knowing Kant's not gonna help you do good applied ethics, good applied AI ethics, any ethics really, because he was wrong about everything. But even Aristotle, who wasn't wrong about everything. All right. Well, thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate you doing this.
My pleasure.